Picture this as Rome, November 1215. The city trembled with anticipation. Bells rang through the cold air, echoing off marble and ruin alike. Every inn, every monastery, every courtyard overflowed with travelers. From the misty shores of Ireland to the deserts of the Holy Land, they came. Bishops and abbots, kings and knights, scholars and spies, all summoned to the eternal city by a single, commanding voice, Pope Innocent III. The Fourth Lateran Council, the largest and most ambitious gathering the Church had ever dared to attempt, was about to begin. And though its official purpose was to reform Christendom, everyone who came to Rome knew the truth. This was about control. The year 1215 was not an age of peace. The Church, though vast and powerful, was bleeding from within. Across the mountains of southern France, a heresy had taken root. The Cathars, the pure ones, preached that the world of flesh was evil and corrupt, that the Church had lost its soul. In Lombardy and the Alps, the Waldensians wandered barefoot, preaching the gospel in their own tongue, declaring that no priest was needed to reach God. To the ears of Rome, these voices were poison, sweet, seductive, and deadly. Innocent III saw the danger more clearly than anyone. He had risen from a young Roman nobleman to the most powerful pontiff in history, a man who crowned emperors, deposed kings, and commanded crusades. But behind his triumphs lay a deep fear that the unity of Christendom, the very foundation of his power, was crumbling beneath him. And so, he called for the greatest council the world had ever seen. He would gather the shepherds of every nation, and together they would purge the wolves. But make no mistake, this was not merely a council of prayer. It was a council of judgment. In the weeks before it began, Rome transformed. Pilgrims crowded the narrow streets. Soldiers guarded the basilicas. Merchants sold relics and parchment prayers to those seeking forgiveness. Inside the Lateran Basilica, workers polished marble columns and hung crimson banners embroidered with gold crosses. It was more than a meeting. It was a declaration of power. The Church reminding the world that it still ruled in both heaven and on earth. When the first day arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Cloaked figures filled the nave, their voices rising in a dozen languages. Beneath the vaulted ceilings, the weight of centuries seemed to press down. Every man there knew that history was about to change, and in the midst of it all stood Innocent, robed in white, crowned in gold, his expression calm, almost divine. He looked upon the assembly and saw not a debate, but a battlefield. A war for the soul of the Church was about to begin, and he intended to win. He raised his hands, and the hall fell silent. "The bride of Christ," he proclaimed, "is stained by corruption. Her body must be cleansed. Her enemies cut away. No one dared to breathe. Outside, the winter wind howled through the streets of Rome like a warning. For in that moment, a line was drawn between faith and fear, salvation and damnation. The bells of the Lateran tolled once more, and Europe's long war against its own children began. Lotario dei Conti di Segni was not born to rule the world, but he believed he was destined to. By the time he became Pope Innocent III, he was barely 37, young, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced that he was the chosen guardian of God's order on earth. He had studied at Paris and Bologna, the twin hearts of medieval intellect. He knew law, theology, and the fragile machinery of power better than any man alive. To his mind, kings were not equals to the Pope. They were instruments, servants of divine will, his will. And so, from the moment of his coronation, Innocent ruled not just as a shepherd of souls, but as an emperor in all but name. He excommunicated monarchs like a general casting down enemies. He forced England's King John to kneel before him and surrender his crown. He placed whole kingdoms under interdict, silencing their churches until their rulers bowed to Rome. But beneath the majesty, Innocent carried a constant dread, a fear not of armies, but of ideas. Whispers of rebellion were spreading through Christendom. The heretics were multiplying, their words carried not by force but by conviction. They preached in marketplaces and on mountain paths, in secret gatherings and candlelit homes. The Cathars spoke of two gods, one of light, one of darkness, and accused the Catholic Church of serving the latter. The Waldensians rejected wealth, renounced clerical privilege, and dared to preach without permission. Everywhere, Innocent's authority was mocked, not by kings, but by cobblers, widows, and shepherds who claimed to know Christ better than the Pope himself. That terrified him, because if truth could live outside Rome, then what was Rome worth? Innocent's response was absolute. Reform the church, crush the heretics, and bind all of Christendom in a single, unified obedience. He would save faith by controlling it completely. He began by reshaping the clergy, demanding purity, forbidding marriage, and tightening the chain of discipline that led from every village priest back to the Vatican. But it wasn't enough. Heresy wasn't just inside the clergy, it was among the people, in their hearts, their words, their questions, and questions to Innocent were the seeds of chaos. So he planned something unprecedented, a gathering so vast it would drown all dissent in the flood of its authority, the Fourth Lateran Council. He would summon the entire hierarchy of the church, from patriarchs to parish priests, from crusader envoys to scholars. Together, they would rewrite the laws of faith itself. No more confusion, no more compromise. From that day forward, belief would have one voice, his. But Innocent's ambition was larger than even he admitted. He didn't just want to restore the church. He wanted to make it eternal, unbreakable, the empire of God on earth. He believed himself a new Moses, descending from the mountain to deliver divine law to humanity. But in his zeal, he forgot that every law can also become a weapon. And so, while Innocent prepared his grand council, others prepared their prayers in secret. In the hills of southern France, the Cathars met in candlelit caves, whispering their scriptures and denouncing Rome as the kingdom of corruption. Innocent's legates heard the rumors and sharpened their swords. The world was moving towards something inevitable, a collision of belief and brutality. And when the bells of the Lateran Basilica finally rang to summon the faithful, it would not be salvation that answered, but fire. On the morning of November 11th, 1215, the bells of the Lateran Basilica rang out over Rome. Their echoes rolled through narrow streets and marble courtyards, summoning the faithful to witness history. Inside, under vast golden ceilings, the church had gathered its might. 400 bishops, 800 abbots, envoys from every kingdom of Christendom, from the frozen lands of Norway to the deserts of Syria. Even the Latin emperor of Constantinople had sent his ambassadors. Never before had so many voices of power stood under one roof. Never again would faith and authority be so tightly bound. The basilica glowed with candlelight and incense. The walls shimmered with mosaics of saints and angels, eternal witnesses to a meeting that would shape the next 500 years. The crowd fell silent as Pope Innocent III rose from his throne, his white robes edged with gold, the triple crown gleaming above his head. When he spoke, his voice filled the hall like thunder. "The bride of Christ," he said, "is wounded by corruption, defiled by sin, and threatened by heresy. We must cleanse her, in head and in members, before the disease consumes the whole." Then, the decrees began to flow like a river of commandment. Over 70 canons, rules that would define medieval Christianity. Confession became mandatory. Once every year, every Christian must kneel before a priest and confess all sins. The Eucharist was defined as literal transformation. The bread and wine became the body and blood of Christ. Clergy were forbidden to marry or bear arms. Schools were to be founded to teach theology, ensuring that no priest would ever again preach ignorance. But one decree cast a shadow over all others. Canon 3, on heretics. The scribe's voice trembled as he read the words aloud. "We excommunicate and anathematize every heretic wherever they may be found. Let them be delivered to the secular arm for punishment, and let rulers cleanse their lands of heresy, or be stripped of power themselves." The room was silent. Every man there understood what it meant. For centuries, the church had punished heresy with words, with sermons, debates, excommunications. But this was something different. This was law. The Pope had just commanded that heretics be hunted. Faith was no longer persuasion. It was obedience. And disobedience would burn. Some bishops hesitated. A few whispered to one another, uneasy. But no one spoke against Innocent. The weight of his authority crushed dissent before it could form. To oppose him was to oppose God. By the council's end, the decrees were sealed. Copies would be carried by couriers and monks to every cathedral in Europe. By spring, they would be read from pulpits, translated into law, and enforced by kings. As the assembly dispersed, the Pope knelt before the altar, his eyes raised toward the crucifix above. He believed he had saved the church. Outside, The streets of Rome were already buzzing with rumor. Some said the council had restored holiness to a corrupted faith. Others whispered that the church had just crowned itself with iron. They did not yet know, but the ink of those decrees would soon mix with blood. The Fourth Lateran Council had ended. The age of mercy had ended with it. The council had ended, but its echoes had only just begun. Couriers rode out from Rome in every direction, their saddlebags heavy with parchment sealed by papal wax. Across mountains and rivers, cathedrals and castles, the decrees of Innocent III spread like divine fire. Within months, the laws of the Lateran had reached every corner of Christendom, and in their wake came fear. In small towns and remote villages, priests stood before their congregations and read the words aloud. All who persist in heresy shall be excommunicated and delivered to the secular arm for punishment. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. The faithful crossed themselves. The guilty kept their eyes down. What had once been a sin of belief was now a crime of state. To doubt the church was to defy the law. To question its authority was treason, not just against Rome, but against God himself. And the Pope's decree had given rulers something they'd long desired: moral justification for domination. Innocent's war on heresy became their war for control. In the south of France, the order was met with thunder. The Albigensian crusade, already burning since 1209, now bore the full weight of papal legitimacy. Every knight, every noble who joined the slaughter of heretics was promised forgiveness of sins, the same reward once given to those who fought for Jerusalem. Holy war had come home. Across Languedoc, towns were besieged and villages set aflame. The Cathars, peaceful, disciplined, unarmed, were hunted as enemies of God. At Béziers, when crusaders asked how to tell heretics from true Christians, the papal legate's answer became legend: kill them all. God will know his own. By evening, the city lay in ashes, 20,000 dead. And still, the legates wrote to Rome, the work of purification continues. But the fire did not stop in France. In Lombardy, Waldensian preachers were dragged from homes and executed before crowds. In the Rhineland, whispered accusations led to public trials and secret tortures. In Germany and Bohemia, nobles used the new decree to silence political rivals, all under the name of defending faith. Everywhere, the church's enemies became invisible. A neighbor's silence, a friend's strange prayer, a woman who refused confession. Anyone could be heretic, and anyone could be saved by betraying one. The sword of faith had been unsheathed, and once drawn, it would not return to its scabbard. Innocent III believed this terror was holy. He called it medicina spiritualis, spiritual medicine. The disease of heresy, he said, must be cut away for the health of the body of Christ. And so Europe bled for its salvation. But something was changing beneath the surface. For every heretic burned, 2 more were made, not by doctrine, but by doubt. The harder Rome pressed for obedience, the more minds began to question. Yet in that moment, few could see it. To most, the Pope's will was God's will, and if God demanded fire, then fire would cleanse the earth. By the time the last ashes of Béziers cooled, the church had discovered its greatest weapon: not persuasion, not miracles, but fear. And fear, once sanctified, becomes unstoppable. Southern France, a land of sunlight, vineyards, and poetry, had become a furnace. The Pope's call to exterminate heresy had turned the hills of Languedoc into holy ground for slaughter. For years, the Cathars had lived quietly among these valleys, tradesmen, nobles, and peasants alike, preaching their creed of simplicity, rejecting the corruption of the world, and refusing to bow before Rome's gold. They owned little, ate little, and lived by one commandment: purity. To Innocent III, purity without obedience was rebellion. To the church, their very existence was blasphemy, and so came the Crusaders. They wore crosses on their cloaks not of pilgrimage, but of purge. French knights, Flemish lords, mercenaries, thousands of them, answering the Pope's promise of eternal salvation for killing the enemies of Christ. In the summer of 1209, they descended upon the city of Béziers. The gates were sealed. Within its walls lived 20,000 men, women, and children, Catholics and Cathars together. When the soldiers demanded to know how to distinguish heretics from the faithful, the papal legate Arnold Amalric gave his infamous reply: kill them all. God will know his own. The army obeyed. Béziers was put to the torch. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but ash and bone. News of the massacre raced across Europe, and rather than horror, it inspired obedience. The slaughter had been sanctified. The Church had made terror holy. City after city fell: Carcassonne, Lavore, Minerve. In each, the same ritual: a call to surrender, a promise of mercy, and then the pyres. The Cathars refused to recant. They walked into the flames singing psalms. Their voices rose above the crackle of burning wood, echoing across the fields as if defying the heavens themselves. To Innocent's legates, their courage was proof of guilt. To the people, it was proof of conviction. The Lateran decrees, read aloud in every conquered town, justified the blood. The Church had declared heresy not merely error, but infection, something to be purged for the soul's salvation. And in Languedoc, that doctrine took its purest, darkest form. By 1215, as Innocent presided over his great council in Rome, his crusaders were still hunting in the south. Fields once green with vines were blackened with soot. Families fled into the mountains. The culture of the troubadours, their poetry, their language, their tolerance, vanished beneath steel and flame. When the council concluded, Innocent confirmed it all. Canon 3, on heretics, gave official blessing to what had already begun. The Albigensian Crusade was no longer a campaign of zealots. It was now church policy. And yet, in his letters, Innocent wrote as though this brutality were mercy. He spoke of cleansing the vineyard of the Lord, of restoring purity to the body of Christ. He saw the ashes as proof of triumph, not tragedy. But history would see differently, for the fires of Languedoc did not end heresy. They made it immortal, in the memories of survivors, in the whispers of refugees, in the silent rage of generations to come. The seed of defiance was planted. The Church had won its war, but lost its innocence. When the flames of Languedoc dimmed, the ashes gave way to something far more enduring: order. Innocent III had conquered rebellion with the sword. Now he would rule the soul with the pen. The decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council were not only forged for punishment, they were blueprints for control. The Church that emerged from 1215 was no longer a loose confederation of bishops and monks. It was an empire of spirit, a machine of obedience. Every Christian, from peasant to prince, was now bound by law to Rome. For the first time, the Pope defined what it meant to believe. The Eucharist, the sacred bread and wine, was no longer symbolic. It was the body and blood of Christ. To doubt it was heresy. Confession became mandatory. Once a year, every soul had to kneel before a priest, bear their sins, and receive absolution. The Church now knew the hearts of its people as kings knew their taxes, and beyond confession came the pulpit. Every priest was commanded to preach, to instruct, to feed the minds of the faithful with doctrine approved by Rome. Ignorance was no longer tolerated, but neither was freedom of thought. To Innocent, this was reform. To history, it was the tightening of chains. The Pope's decrees reached even into the homes of believers. Marriage was declared a holy sacrament, indissoluble and under church authority. No union, no birth, no death could occur without the blessing of the clergy. The rhythms of life itself were now measured by the Church's clock. But Innocent's genius, or his curse, was that he cloaked domination in devotion. He spoke of salvation while building systems of surveillance. He called obedience a virtue while crafting laws that punished doubt. In every cathedral, schools were established to train new theologians, loyal, learned, and unquestioning. The Church's army would no longer only march in armor, it would march in robes, in classrooms, in pulpits. Knowledge became a weapon as sharp as any sword, and yet, not all within the Church welcomed this new order. Some bishops murmured that faith was being replaced with fear. Some monks, who had once preached poverty, watched uneasily as Rome grew richer, its courts more magnificent, its decrees more absolute. But Innocent's grip was unyielding. To challenge him was to challenge God's law itself. Through him, the Church had achieved what no empire before it ever had: control not just over bodies, but over consciences. Europe had entered a new age, not of faith's expansion, but of faith's regulation, and perhaps the most dangerous part of all, people accepted it. After the chaos of heresy and war, obedience felt like peace. After the smoke and screams, silence felt holy. But beneath that silence, something restless stirred. The human spirit, even when bound by creed, still longs to question, to wonder, to see for itself. And those who dare to look beyond the walls of Rome would soon find themselves facing a new creation, one born directly from the council's decrees. It would come quietly at first, but soon it would speak in every language, in every court, in every fearful whisper. The church had purified itself, and in doing so, it had created something even more powerful. The Inquisition was coming. It began with parchment, letters sealed with red wax, bearing the weight of papal law, riding out from cathedral cities to the furthest towns of Christendom. Each one carried a simple message: root out heresy. The command was clear, but its execution, monstrous. In the wake of the Fourth Lateran Council, local bishops were ordered to investigate rumors of false belief. At first, it was clumsy. A bishop questioning a merchant here, a priest confronting a parishioner there. But soon, a pattern formed. Records were kept, confessions noted, punishments standardized, and from those fragments of procedure, something immense began to take shape. A system. By mid-century, the bishops' crude investigations had evolved into a new institution, the Holy Inquisition. No longer a passing campaign or a crusader's sword, it was now an office of the church itself, permanent, bureaucratic, methodical. Its purpose, to save the soul by forcing it to confess. The inquisitor was unlike any priest before him. He carried no parish, no flock, only authority. He answered directly to Rome. Wherever he went, he could demand the aid of nobles, summon witnesses, seize property, and compel the faithful to testify. A single accusation was enough to destroy a life. A whispered rumor, a neighbor's envy, a rival's lie. Once summoned, there was no presumption of innocence, only the demand to repent. Those who confessed were punished lightly, a pilgrimage, a public flogging, a mark of shame. Those who refused, those who dared to hold to their beliefs, were handed to the secular arm, the executioner's fire, so that the church's hands might remain ceremonially clean. In some places, the Inquisition took root like iron. In Toulouse and Carcassonne, inquisitors built archives, meticulous records of every confession, every penance, every pyre. In Lombardy, entire villages were questioned, one name leading to another, until the fear itself became the only truth left standing. And everywhere the same refrain echoed: better to burn one soul than risk the infection of many. But beneath the surface of righteousness, corruption thrived. A noble could accuse a rival to seize his lands, a debtor could denounce his creditor and erase his obligation. Even faith became currency, traded, falsified, weaponized. Rome saw the results and called them holy victory. The heresies waned, the churches filled, the people obeyed. Yet obedience bought through terror is brittle. It cracks in silence. In private, some priests wept for those they condemned. Some monks questioned the justice of a God who required flames. But the machine had already learned to move without mercy, and once built, it did not stop. The Inquisition was the final triumph of innocence design. He had wanted purity, discipline, unity. He had given the church a weapon that would endure for centuries. It would reach Spain, Portugal, Bohemia, even the New World. It would outlive kingdoms, devour empires, and carve its mark into the human soul. And yet, like all weapons of fear, it carried within it a paradox. The more completely it silenced dissent, the more deeply it buried the seed of rebellion. For every cry that the flames consumed, another rose in the heart of someone watching. And someday, that whisper would grow into a roar the church could no longer control. Summer, 1216. The sun hung low over Italy, heavy with heat. In a quiet chamber in the city of Perugia, the most powerful man in Christendom lay dying. Pope Innocent III, the ruler who had bent kings to his will, who had commanded crusades and councils, who had shaped the destiny of Europe, was now frail, feverish, and alone with his thoughts. Around him, the world still trembled under the echo of his voice. The church he had forged was stronger than ever, vast, disciplined, unquestioned. His decrees had remade Europe's conscience. His council had silenced heresy, purified the priesthood, and bound every Christian to the authority of Rome. He had dreamed of a perfect order, a church united in truth and obedience, a mirror of heaven on earth. Now, as the shadows lengthened, he believed he had achieved it, but history, unseen by him, was already writing a different story. across the plains of Languedoc, smoke still rose from the ruins of Cathar towns. In the valleys of Lombardy, the Waldensians hid in caves, clutching their scriptures by candlelight. In the dark corners of Europe, mothers whispered prayers not to be overheard. The fires he had kindled in the name of faith had not gone out. They had spread. Yet in his final hours, Innocent did not doubt. He saw himself as the servant of divine order, a doctor healing the wounds of the church. "I have washed the bride of Christ," he is said to have whispered, "in the blood of her enemies." The irony would outlive him. When death finally came, there was no grandeur. His body was laid out in a monastery chapel, stripped of its gold and jewels by the very attendants who had once bowed before him. The man who had ruled empires died poor, his robes torn by thieves, his legacy already contested. To some, his death was a moment of mourning. To others, it was a moment of relief. News of his passing spread quickly. In the courts of Europe, kings bowed their heads, but quietly celebrated the loosening of Rome's grip. In the fields and forests, heretics who had fled persecution dared to breathe again, if only for a moment. But the system Innocent created did not die with him. His council had birthed a structure too strong, too intricate to vanish. His vision of a church that governed every aspect of life, that policed thought, that punished doubt, had become self-sustaining. Even as his body decayed, the Inquisition was gathering strength. New inquisitors were being trained, new manuals of procedure written, new prisons built. His successors would wield his decrees like weapons, more ruthlessly, more efficiently than he ever imagined. In death, Innocent became immortal, not as a saint, but as an architect. He had constructed a fortress around faith, high and unbreakable. But every fortress cast a shadow, for within its walls, the very soul of Christendom began to suffocate. The more perfect his system became, the less space there was for mercy. Innocent III died believing he had saved the church. History would remember that he also taught it how to burn. Innocent III was gone, but the world he built did not fade. It hardened. His decrees, sealed in Rome and scattered across Christendom, became the skeleton of medieval life. Every church, every courtroom, every conscience bore the mark of 1215. The Fourth Lateran Council had created a new kind of Christianity, one that was total, unyielding, and absolute. Faith was no longer only prayer and mystery, it was structure, a vast, intricate web of laws, rituals, and obligations that reached into every corner of human existence. From the moment of birth to the moment of death, the church was present. Baptism at the cradle, confession at maturity, marriage under the priest's blessing, last rites at the grave. It was impossible to live or die outside its grasp. In schools and cathedrals, theology became the queen of all knowledge. Men like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus would build entire worlds of logic upon the foundations Innocent had laid. A faith that explained, categorized, and justified every part of creation. To question that structure was to question God himself, and yet the structure was cracking. For every cathedral that rose in splendor, another village whispered of hypocrisy. For every monk who preached obedience, another questioned whether obedience had replaced belief. The Inquisition, born as a tool of purity, had become a machine of fear. Its tribunals reached from France to Germany, from Italy to Bohemia. Heresy became a mirror. Anyone could see their reflection in it. No one was safe from accusation. Centuries passed, and still the church's shadow grew. By the 15th century, it had become both the heart of Europe and its cage. But ideas, like embers, can survive in ash. In hidden valleys, the descendants of the Waldensians still met in secret, reading the forbidden scriptures in their own tongues. In the ruins of southern France, memories of the Cathars lingered like ghosts, and among scholars and priests, quiet doubts began to stir. The decrees of the Lateran Council had sought to define truth forever, but truth cannot be caged. Men like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia began to speak of a faith that belonged to the soul, not to Rome. They denounced indulgences, challenged papal power, and called for scripture in the language of the people. For their courage, Hus was burned at the stake, but his ashes blew north and found a man named Martin Luther. In 1517, more than 300 years after Innocent's council, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. It was the sound of history breaking. The walls the Lateran Council had built to protect faith now cracked open to release it. The Reformation had begun, the rebellion of conscience against control, and though Innocent could never have imagined it, his dream of a perfect church had created its opposite. By seeking to silence heresy, he had given birth to a world where every man could stand before God alone. Still, the echo of 1215 lingered, in every confession whispered to a priest, in every mass spoken in Latin, in every ritual of authority that demanded submission before understanding. 8 centuries later, that echo has not died. It hums beneath every question of faith and power that humanity still asks. For once a truth is chained by fear, the struggle to free it never ends. 8 centuries have passed since the bells of the Lateran rang. Their echo has faded into history, but their meaning still burns. The Fourth Lateran Council sought to save the soul of Europe. It did, but at a terrible cost. It gave the Church strength, structure, and unity, but it also taught faith to fear itself. From its decrees came both the beauty and the brutality of the Middle Ages, the cathedrals that soared toward heaven, and the pyres that lit the night in its name. It forged the universities, the schools, the libraries, and the inquisitions, the censorship, the silencing of thought. It made belief powerful, and power sacred. Innocent III had imagined a perfect world, a world ruled by divine order, where every soul was bound together in obedience to truth. But truth, once bound, begins to suffocate. The centuries that followed proved what Innocent never understood, that faith cannot be commanded. It must be chosen. The moment it becomes law, it ceases to be love. And yet, from the ashes of his empire of fear, light began to rise. The same church that once forbade questioning would later nurture philosophers, reformers and saints who dared to ask. The same institution that built the Inquisition would one day defend the right of conscience. Even within Rome, centuries later, voices would rise to say, "No more fire for faith, no more fear for truth." History is never simple. Every age of darkness carries the spark of its own redemption. The fires of Languedoc that once consumed the Cathars also ignited the long journey toward religious freedom. The chains of confession that once bound conscience also forged intimacy between man and his soul. The laws that once silenced inquiry eventually built the universities that set the human mind free. The legacy of 1215, then, is not just a warning. It is a mirror. It shows us what happens when power dresses itself in holiness, when conviction forgets compassion, when order crushes wonder. We still live in its shadow. Every time ideology demands obedience, every time authority claims the right to define truth, every time fear is used to silence a voice, the echo of the Fourth Lateran Council returns. And yet, so too does the lesson it left behind, that no council, no decree, no empire of faith can extinguish the human desire to seek, to know, to believe freely. The Fourth Lateran Council tried to control belief. It failed, for belief, real belief, cannot be dictated by fear. It rises again and again, like light through smoke. So when you hear the words truth and purity spoken in the same breath as obedience, remember this story. Remember the council that sought to save faith by silencing it, and the centuries of courage it inspired in those who refused to kneel. Because history doesn't repeat. It reminds, and what it reminds us is simple. The moment faith forgets freedom, it becomes its own heresy.
If this story moved you, if you believe history's lessons still matter, share it. Because the war for truth is never truly over, it simply changes its battlefield. Subscribe for the next story, where we uncover another moment when belief, power, and courage collided to shape the world we live in today.